Maybe I should first start out with who I am. My name is Joe Dolling. I'm the Chief Forester for British Columbia. I've been kicking around the company for about 20 years now, mostly on the operational side of things, and then most recently in this role corporately, replacing Mark Tamas, who all of you probably knew from him coming around and chatting with all of you. I'm going to try and make my way around to see everyone as well at some point, but pretty head down right now. So this is an exciting topic. How this all came to be is Murray is a board member on the Science Center, a pretty cool organization that I'm a member of, and my family's a member of, and I would encourage others to be members of. They do really neat stuff for kids, all kinds of programs. But one of the things they have done is they have a monthly Meet and Geek topic event. So it's an adult event. They have drinks and some appetizers, and a monthly speaker that speaks on something science-based, and it's a really interesting topic. I've been to a few of them now, and it's great. The most recent one was Murray did a presentation, and it's this very presentation on fire. And I went to it. Al Thorlickson was also there. And coming out of that meeting, he was really excited about the presentation and thought, hey, we should get this tuned up and show it to our staff and our employees, because it's a really important message. And there's so much counter messaging out there in the media and environmentalists and a whole bunch of things. So I'm proud of what we do as TOCO. I'm proud of us harvesting trees and doing all the things that we do. We do it in an environmentally responsible, sustainable way. And there's a lot of information out there that says the contrary. So this is part of the messaging for our employees to help them understand that, hey, we come to work every day, there's a positive influence. There's a positive influence on fire that we can have. There's a positive influence on the climate. We're not a climate problem, we're part of the climate solution. And that's a really important message for all of our employees to hear, so that we can come to work and feel proud about the work we do. And that's how I feel every day coming to work. And I would encourage others to feel that way. And this is one of the first steps in getting us there. I think it's an important message. Now we'll talk about Murray. Murray's been a
That's
long...
enough. That's enough.
So Murray started his career in 1977 on wildfire suppression crew. And he's the guy that was dangling on other helicopters on a rappel line. Sorry? On a rappel line, initial attack fires. He was out there first on scene with a hatchet or a Pulaski and putting these fires out, early attack. And then throughout his career, he's taken on many, many roles, from harvesting supervision to woodlands manager. And he ultimately ended his career with TOCO as a stewardship and sustainability manager for BC and Manitoba. And throughout all of his time, he's had an active role in fires on the operational side. Through our heavy fire years of 2017 and 18, he was actively involved in a lot of that work. And he's got a tremendous experience of over 30 years in the industry. He's a graduate of Selkirk College in 1981, and he also is a registered professional forester, and he graduated from the University of Alberta. They won't hold that against him. So anyway, with over 30 years of experience, please welcome Murray Wilson.
Thanks, Joe, and I'm not an Oilers fan, so they still have included me anyway. I'm kind of giving away my talk right at the end. This is the answer for at the end. Active, sustainable forest management will reduce wildfires and their impacts. That's really what I'm talking about, and that's the solution for a lot of our wildfire woes. Joe talked about my early career. I started off in 1977 in the Northwest Territories on a helicopter suppression crew for a couple summers, then a couple years on the rappel crew out of Salmon Arm. And one thing that did is I saw a lot of fires at their very early stage, and then sometimes I saw fires, project fires in the hundreds of thousands of hectares. So I got to see a lot of things. And one of the things that I learned really quickly was that if you don't put fires out when they're small, really you don't put them out. When you see these large scale fires, 10,000, 20,000 hectare fires, they get put out when the weather changes, when it rains, when the wind changes, when they hit a different type of fuel. But once they're big, we don't put them out. The other thing I learned is that it's also very much like a war. If you look at it, they have bombers, they have helicopter crews, they have initial attack crews, they have critical incident command. So very much like a war attacking the fires. But today I'm not going to talk about how we fight fires. I'm going to hopefully offer a solution on how we can put them out or stop them from starting. So we talk about 5 areas. Basically, it's background, wildfire history, forest health, which is a huge issue of how fires start, talk about the 17, 18, and 21 fires, and then what I think we can do. So it's important to have a little bit of background because I'm not going to try to be too technical, but there's a few things that help you to understand things. And one is, I'll talk a lot about hectares. And hectares are kind of a, what is a hectare? Well, it's 100 meters by 100 meters, but basically a Canadian football field is about 0.8 of a hectare. If you're a rugby player, a rugby pitch is almost exactly a hectare. So if you hear hectares, think of a football field, close enough. That'll give you an indication. The other thing is we have a lot of different tree species in British Columbia, and they react differently. So if you look at around the Okanagan here, in our low elevations, we have thick bark trees. So ponderosa pine, very thick bark. They have a taproot, which means that they're spread out. They can stand up in the wind like a carrot, the taproot is. And as we move up a little higher, we get into almost pure stands of Douglas fir. Once again, they have thick bark, and they have not a lot of material on the ground, so grass fires would go through here every 10, 15, 20 years naturally. As we get higher up, we get into thin bark species. That's your lodgepole pine, spruce balsam up at Silver Star, and they have thin bark. So if a fire goes through there, they don't survive typically. And they have lateral roots, so if they're spread out, the trees are scattered, the wind takes them and tips them over. So the low elevation trees, they can resist ground fires. The higher elevations, not so much. The wetter areas in the province, we have we'll have a whole variety: cedar, hemlock, spruce, balsam. It's called the interior cedar hemlock. An important thing that's very different in British Columbia and Canada than most places in the world, the green area is crown or public land. 95% of the land base is crown owned. So that means most places in the world, it's probably 40% of the land base is private. It means that the way we manage our forests, the way we manage our wildfires is dictated by government. TOCO doesn't get to decide what happens. Regulations set up by government tell us what's going to happen. And when you look at it, this is the big circle is British Columbia, and it shrinks down as you go forward. 95 million hectares of land base, about 55 million hectares of that has trees on it. Of that, about 40% is available for timber harvesting, 22 million, about 40%. About 23% of the overall land base is available for harvesting. This is a little bit old slide. It says 200,000 hectares a year, a little less than 1% of the land base, but it's probably down to 150,000 hectares now. An important issue that is in the news quite a bit lately is old growth. And I think so far the government has deferred another 2.3 million hectares for old growth preservation. If you look at the slide there, that's me on the west coast of Vancouver Island. A large, magnificent old growth tree that I think all of us would agree is very special. It's magnificent when you see it, awe-inspiring. Photo on the other side is old growth in the new definition. This is about a 140-year-old stand in the Williams Lake area. So we're deferring this. We're talking about the photo on my right, but that I think people think we're talking about old growth, but in reality, we're deferring a lot of these areas. And these areas are not going to survive hundreds and hundreds of years. That's not their ecology. So what's happening with our weather? Well, I pulled this out in May, around May 1st from a government website. On the far right, that was June. I just left it in there just to show you the dark red is well above average. And so just to give you an idea, they're pretty accurate in their forecast. So we did have, and you see Western Canada and Ontario, very hot June. If you look at July, Southern BC, Alberta, for the most part, above average. Saskatchewan, Manitoba, well above. The August forecast is very similar. So a warmer summer this year. So that means typically more fires. There's all kinds of different projections on climate. If you look at the one on my right, your left, that's kind of today. And then this one on my left is climate change zones in the 2080. So out in time. So you don't have to look at all the numbers, but you get the idea that the forecasts are showing that we're going to have warmer weather, hotter weather, which typically means more fires. Well, wildfires are not something new. We've had them for thousands of years. Our forests are, nobody planted them. They came back after large-scale disturbance events. We planted the recent ones, but not the old ones. We've had large-scale fires for hundreds and thousands of years, and we will continue to have them. And you can see that on the landscape. We can look at the older ones through dendrochronology, looking at tree rings, but just some of the old photos you can see on the right, your left-hand side is Banff around 1905. You can see it 95 years later on the right, just with the trees coming back after the fire. And similarly, Nelson, British Columbia, 1881 on your left, Nelson basically today, just showing that our forests change over time. We've had fires for a long time, we will continue to have fires. And this is a little closer to home for us. On the left, this is the site of the old Shepherd's Hardware, basically in Armstrong. Looking up on that hill, vast forest fires that burnt off those slopes and what it looks like today. And nature will change that. It doesn't let trees get old forever. There is a fire or some kind of change that reverts it back to the initial stages. If you're a skier, I just threw this one in at the top, that Silver Star from an aerial photo in the 1940s. And Proctor Lake over on the right, just showing you that Silver Star wasn't a lot of tree skiing back then. It was very open. Okanagan Mountain Park, just the last one. This is 2003. This made the news worldwide. This was, I worked in Kelowna prior to this, and Okanagan Mountain Park was about 11,000 hectares, and it had been severely impacted by mountain pine beetle. And the south slopes of Kelowna had pine beetle as well. And there was lots of controversy about any kind of harvesting in there. It didn't happen. The lightning strike hit this and it burnt that park in one day, 11,000 hectares. And if you remember, it kept burning, and Kelowna was in danger. Over 200 homes were burning. So fires have been here for a long time. We'll continue to have fires. Forest health. Probably this is one of the biggest impacts of our trees as they get older. They're less resistant to disease and insects, and they die. So in the 1980s, we had a large outbreak of mountain pine beetle in this area, but we had a cold winter in 1985, 30 below, and it killed the beetles and it stopped it. But it came back with a resurgence in the 1990s and 2000, and we ended up getting 18.2 million hectares impacted by mountain pine beetle. Think about that. 20% of the province was killed by mountain pine beetle. This is Blackwell Lake, which is on our Tocos Tree Farm license, just west of Monte Lake. We have an insect and disease for all of our trees. This is Douglas fir bark beetle, and you can see on the vertical axis, the y-axis, it goes hectares up to 120,000 hectares, and then decades coming along the bottom. And you can see it's significantly increased. And Douglas fir bark beetle is set to really explode now because it attacks stressed trees. So after a fire, not all of the trees die, but they're stressed. So the Douglas fir bark beetle comes into those fires, attacks those trees, and when the trees are dead, it looks for a new host. So it leaves, just like throwing a pebble in water, they expand out with rings. So if you think of the Elephant Hill fire around Savannah in that area, Douglas fir bark beetle is exploding outside of that. And Douglas fir bark beetle, if it doesn't have a dead host, its host is green trees, and it's the largest and oldest trees are the ones that it goes after. And we have, like I said, we've got other insects and disease. Spruce bark beetle, this is in the Prince George area. Hectares on the vertical axis, 600,000 hectares. And basically, we've done nothing with this infestation. So the Prince George area, Mackenzie area, very ripe for more fires. I put the Bowen outbreak on there from the 1980s because that was very controversial. There was a large harvesting operation that took place. It was on National Geographic. They said you can see it from space, but you can see it's absolutely dwarfed at only 100,000 hectares by what's happening right now in north central British Columbia. And really, this slide shows the amount of trees, merchantable trees, I would say that were trees that we could use for forest products, killed since 1999. And kind of the I don't know what color that is, kind of a reddy color, very high, greater than 45%. So if you look at the caribou operations west of Williams Lake, Burns Lake, there you can see that over almost half of the trees were killed during that period of time. And you can see those dark redder splotches and the purple splotches on there show the fires in 2017 and 2018, showing a strong correlation with dead trees and fire. And you can see further down in Kamloops and stuff like that, the Elephant Hill fire, very dead right around Kamloops. And if you look at the moderate level, which is kind of the yellowy gold, 14 to 30%. Most of the rest of the central part of the province is has a significant death of trees. I don't have the data for the coast and northern BC. So when you get, we did accelerate the harvesting for lodgepole pine to try and salvage some of the wood, but we didn't get it all. So that left huge stands of dead trees. And you can, something like this, you can imagine if you're a firefighter going into this, this is like stacked matchsticks. It's explosive. They can't put a fire out when it gets into this. And it is, I mean, it's just impossible. So what happened in 2017, 18, and 21? So this is a map on your right of the Okanagan. So Osoyoos in the south, all the way up to the top end of Shuswap Lake, Anstey Arm, Sugar Lake over on the east, and Peachland over on the west. That covers about 2.25 million hectares. And if you look at the very top, you can see a picture of British Columbia with a dark green blotch, just showing you the area in comparison. And in those 3 years, we burnt 3.43 million hectares, 1.5 times the size of this image, basically the size of Belgium. And this year we're already at 1.4 million hectares, so we're larger than the Netherlands, which has 18 million people living there that we burnt in those 4 years. If you're from Williams Lake, this is just north of Williams Lake, and the very top where you can kind of see a switchbacky road, that's the Rudy Johnson Bridge, if you're familiar with that area. But it's an interesting photo for me. A bunch of things I look at. One is you can see the roads and the Fraser River made no difference to the fire. When it gets that big, it doesn't stop. It jumped both sides of it. On your left, you can see kind of the steeper slopes, and it's kind of white looking, and that it shows a very intense fire. So on steeper slopes, the fire will burn hotter, and that's a concern because then you get more erosion. It's burnt off like that. If you look over on the other side of the river, you can see that there's very intense areas, black, that are burnt heavy, but amazingly enough, the fire skips areas. You can see some places are singed, and some are just have green trees. And fires really flow like a river. If you see them, you'll see solid patches, but it is kind of, you expect everything burnt, but it doesn't. It kind of moves around. And there were massive impacts. If you think back into 2017, 65,000 people evacuated, a lot of TOCO employees significantly impacted, 300 structures burnt down. The difference was California had about 700,000 hectares burnt in 2018, but 85 people died. The difference is population. That's how we dodged the bullet on it. Very significant impact to the communities. And we can't forget about smoke. This particular table shows, has scales from 0 to 10. Any rating 7 or higher is considered a high health risk. So all these are dots that have days that are 7 or higher for health risks. So if you look at the Prince George area, kind of the top of the photo, on your left you can see the fires. 32 days where the smoke impact was considered a high health risk to people. You come down south, you can see Castlegar had 30 days in that 2018, and that was the fire just north on the Arrow Lakes that significantly impacted them. You see the Okanagan, we were about 15, 18 days in there. So very significant for a lot of people. And it's not just smoke. There's significant impacts to communities, and people in this room know it well, that people, when they went back to the community in Williams Lake and those areas, people were afraid to go back to their homes. Young kids the next year, we talk to people that live there, it gets smoky or gets hot, they get anxious. What's going to happen? First Nations communities were significantly impacted because of a lot of them are in rural areas. So fires impacted them very significantly. if you own a fishing lodge or something like that, people aren't booking it. They're worried about the smoke. And we saw that here in the Okanagan where tourism went away. Water impacts, wildlife. I don't know if I believe the stats, but I saw that World Wildlife Fund said when the Australian wildfires killed 3 billion animals. I think they probably counted, but it does. It significantly impacts. Squirrels climb trees. They don't make it. Wildlife can't outrun the pace of fires. And community stability. People don't feel comfortable living in those areas anymore. So I only have one tough question for you. So how much CO2 does BC emit annually? And interesting part about this question is we don't count carbon emissions from wildfires in British Columbia or Canada. They're considered natural. So there's a couple options. One is 65 million tons a year, 102 million tons, or 672 million tons. Anybody guess, anyone?
65?
You got it. 65 million tons is what British Columbia emits annually. 102 million tons is Washington State. Canada is 672 million tons. If you compared that to China, I think they're 10,000 something million tons. What's interesting for me is I look at it in 2017 and 18, the estimates were we released 360 million tons of carbon. So in those from all other sources, it was 130 million tons, almost triple from wildfires in those years. If you look at that from a car perspective, that's the equivalent to 78 million cars. British Columbia has about 3.7 million vehicles. So you look at the impacts, all the efforts that we're doing to electrify cars, to get rid of fossil fuels, and we're not considering wildfires. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. This is a bigger issue. It's something that we can do something about. After the fire, there's still significant impacts. In those 3 years, we spent about $600 million a year fighting forest fires in British Columbia. And as I mentioned, once they get big, it's really tough to put them out. So we're kind of band-aiding them when they get really big. There's timber supply impacts. So availability for timber harvesting. I mean, you look at these areas, we're not going to harvest them, but the cut has to get affected, the amount that we can harvest as a company. Reforestation. If we harvest an area, by law, we put in a silviculture plan of how we're going to reforest that area. We have strict rules of what's going to happen. Nothing's going to happen with these areas. And there's significant ecological impacts. In 2017-18, I spent some time in Williams Lake, and they had ecologists and foresters looking at these sites, and some of them were so, remember if you think back of the photo I had of the dead lodgepole pines stacked up like matchsticks, those fires have burnt so intensely, they don't think that trees will grow back there for 60 years. So then you flip back and you talk about the carbon situation and say, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense. You know, if we're going to let these areas burn and we've emitted all that carbon, but on top of that, new trees store, sequester carbon, it's not going to happen for another 60 years. So the impact is significantly more than just that initial release of carbon.
Murray, could you just explain free to grow in a high level sense that when we cut on Crown land, that our legal and financial obligation is to replant the crop, and explain to the group what free to grow means?
Yeah, so Toko has license of 10 years like other forest companies, and when we harvest an area, we have to submit a silviculture prescription. And then basically it tells everything we're going to do, how many trees we're going to plant per hectare, what tree species, what density. On top of that, we have to do surveys, and the trees are our responsibility until they meet a certain height and a certain density and spacing on the trees. So for us, that could be as early as 8 or 9 years, or it could be 20 years later. We still have the responsibility after the harvesting takes place to look after those trees. After that, it reverts back to the Crown, to the government.
So we have a financial responsibility on our balance sheet. So if they, like Murray said, if they don't have the audit, it's not there, if the crop's not replanted, we have to get it growing and turn it back to the Crown. So every time we harvest, we have a legal obligation and a financial responsibility, every forest company, to replant the crop and ensure that we hand it back to the landlord. Because as Murray said, we're working on public base. So if I'm going to ask you, we don't just head out with a chainsaw and start whacking stuff down. We plant it and then we replant it and the way it should be. So that's why it's called free to grow. We basically at that point the tree is won't be eaten by the deers, and we think that it's natural and able to sustain itself. So.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. It's kind of a sore point for me. I look at the amount.
Murray, what free to grow? What's height? It was a question rather than a marketing guy answer. Maybe we'll get a forester to answer it. So free to grow is what height?
It depends. So we have different ecological zones in the province and different site series. I think there's probably 300 somewhere in that area. So everyone has different targets, but usually it's above 50% height above any competing vegetation, I think is the standard they use. So if you had brush that was a meter high, your trees have to be at least 1.5 meters tall. Does that help?
Yeah.
6 feet.
If a forest fire comes through and takes out the area before we've hit that target, do we have to go and replant it again?
That's a complicated question.
We're still responsible for it.
We're still responsible for it, but we do, I guess, we go back and see there's a section 108 that we can say, can we get funding to do this? So there's some back and forth with it.
So we're going through that now, because if it's free to grow and we've handed it back to the Crown, then it's back to the province. If it's not free to grow, it's on our balance sheet, and then Murray says a bit of a discussion. I think part of what people don't recognize, and I actually had some of my friends that I hang out with, is what does it matter if it burns? It'll grow back anyway. Well, the government doesn't have endless supplies of money, so even if it's on their balance sheet, they may not go and replant it, versus if it's on our balance sheet and we harvest it, we have to replant it. So I would say, Murray, maybe you have a lot of the burnt forest doesn't get replanted. So then either it's delayed in restocking, you don't get the commercial benefit, or in some places it's so damaged that the trees won't come back for 60, 70 years because the soil's been so damaged because of the heat. I don't know if I got that right, Murray, or?
Yeah, this is a perfect example. Like these trees are scorched, the soil is gone. I'll talk about it in the next slide about what happens with water. But since 2007, I think the numbers I saw, the province has planted 130,000 hectares of forest fires. We burnt 1.2 in 2017. We burnt 1.3 in 2018. So you see, it's a very small number that comes back after fire. Some of them come back naturally, but these ones don't. That are burnt that intensely, that kind of kill. Is that it?
Thanks, Murray.
Water is a very significant impact, and I can say, working with Joe and Travis and other people and Chris in the room before, we spend a significant time in forest management on water. That's probably their biggest focus in the Okanagan. And so fires have a very significant impact. This is the Hayman fire in Denver in 2002. And what happens after a fire, in a very intense fire, there's a chemical reaction in the soil, and it's called it gets hydrophobic. So basically it repels the water. It's like someone put a sheet of plastic on top of the soil. So the water doesn't infiltrate into the soil, it stays on top. So what happens is you get flooding and you get erosion. So you think this last summer that Whiteman's Creek in the spring called it a 200-year event. Not surprising for, I think, anyone in the natural resource industry, because significant fire on that side, water stays on top. When it runs off, snow melts, you have problems. And just to give you a scale of problems, this was 2002. Denver spent $27 million just cleaning up the debris in the reservoirs. Their overall costs were estimated at $250 million to clean up the watershed after the fire. The fire was about 50,000 hectares. And so for us, if you're irrigation districts, we get our water from the high elevations. Significant concern when you have wildfires. And I think the big thing that forests change over time. And I think if you look at it, it's called succession, but you think about your own family, the kids are small here, they grow, they get bigger, and they get older. Forests do the same thing. And we basically put administrative boundaries around our forests and say they're always going to stay that way. They won't. The forests change all the time. There's different stages. We have all collective memories of things in a certain way, and then we go back and they're different. And that's the same with forests. They change over time. So in those 3 years alone, 691,000 hectares of parks and protected areas burned. 700,000 hectares of areas we said were going to stay like this always didn't. We also had another 177,000 hectares of old growth management areas. areas set aside for old growth that burned. We had another 263,000 hectares areas where we said we don't want to see harvesting, we want you to hide it around communities, which really is the wrong approach. I mean, those areas are highly susceptible to fire. Another 260,000 hectares of those burned. And there's all kinds of stats on wildlife and everything else. But my point is, forests are dynamic. You can't just put boundaries around them and say they're going to stay the same. And I kind of look at this and say, you know, if we think of our homes and we say if we just leave them that way, they'll always stay the same. They don't, and our forests don't. They need active management. So finally, what can we do? For me, it's fairly straightforward. Reduce the age and density of our forests. So our forests are thick, make them thinner. We need to have old growth for sure, but if we let all of our forests get older, they're more susceptible to insect and disease, more susceptible to fire. And we have some good examples of healthy young forests are more fire resistant. This is Terrace Mountain. This was a fire in 2009 on TFL 49 totals, and you can see the top is mature trees that were all burnt. The fire hit the young stands and didn't burn them. And these aren't special photos. I can show you photos all across the province like this. BC Wildfire Service has them, entire blocks. Maple Lake, where Joe was on that fire a couple of years ago, you can see the same thing. I was just out there 2 weeks ago. You can see the blocks that we've logged in the past didn't burn, the mature timber round did.
So just back to that picture, so that kind of reddy brown, the fire came into the young trees and died out. Isn't that?
Yes.
Is that? So it did kill some of the trees, but it wasn't able to burn through, right?
Yeah, and the difference too, Brad, was in this era, I worked in Kelowna, we used to do a lot of broadcast burning after the fire, after we logged, to clean the sites and then plant them. And that basically got stopped because of smoke concerns. And the other concern is they said we wanted more coarse woody debris. So when you see a messy block, we're often, what looks messy, required to leave debris for nutrient cycling. And now that's become a problem because the areas are more susceptible to fires. And this is Joe Rich. You may have remembered that fire. I remember looking up off the roof here and seeing that big column of smoke. This was mature forest, and this acted as a fire break. The blocks of love we logged for pine beetle in the late 80s. You can see that it hit that and it stopped. So when you think of fire, there's really two things that start fires: people and lightning. But it has to have three things in order for a fire to take place. This is called a fire triangle. If you take one of these elements away, the fire goes out. It doesn't start. So oxygen, we can't do a lot about that. Wind comes along, we're not stopping it. Heat, hot summer, we can't do much about that. The one thing we can do something about is fuel. So if we reduce the risk from fuel, and that's my point about when trees get older, they're more susceptible to insect and disease, and then they're more of a fuel source. So think of this when you think of fire. The one thing we can control is fuel. And the big thing, this is Tweedsmuir Park in the 1990s, and this was kind of ground zero for mountain pine beetle. This is west of Williams Lake, Burns Lake kind of area, spectacular area. This had mountain pine beetle in the late 80s and 90s, and then it just exploded out elsewhere. Natural process. It's, for the most part, burnt now after the fires in 2018. But my point from this slide is, instead of focusing on individual trees, you need to look at the landscape, the whole area, and say what's happening across the landscape and manage the landscape versus the individual trees. So I thought, well, what are other countries doing? So I looked at Finland. Finland is about, I haven't been there myself, but I talked to people that have, read up on it, and Finland covers about 33 million hectares. British Columbia is about 3 times the size. Harvesting in Finland was about 75 million meters, a third of the size of British Columbia. We logged about 54 million meters that year. I think we're down to 40 million meters now, something like that. Ageless forest, they do several treatments, very integrated. They clear cut it at 50 to 110 years of age. We're starting trees as young as 140, and it's called natural disturbance type 3 in interior, of saying those are old growth trees, we need to save them. I'm not against old growth trees at all. I'm just saying in these areas, they're not going to stay that way forever. So what happens? Their forests are healthy, ours are declining. They've got 12% protected area. That was the Brundtland Commission back in the 80s, our common future. BC has bumped that up to 30% just because, and I think we're probably there already, but the results are interesting. 6 out of the last 10 years in Finland, they had 0 hectares burned. 323 hectares averaged over 10 years. This stat will be higher now, but we're at 426,000 hectares burnt in the last 10 years per year. Remember the earlier slide I showed, we're logging less than half of that.
So Maria, I've been thinking about this. Is it fair to compare Scandinavia with a more northern climate? And I was just there and it was very warm, so I have to be careful how I word this, but I mean, I'm not disagreeing with your math, but is Scandinavia not a different geoclimatic zone, and how comparable is the fire risk to that zone? And I know you haven't been there, but what are your thoughts on comparing?
Excellent question. If you look at where Finland is, higher latitude, then take a look and say what's happening in our higher latitudes in Canada.
Yeah.
Significant fires in Fort Nelson, significant fires in high level, significant fires across the whole boreal forest is burning. So if you would say that is a similar forest to what they're having in Finland, and our results are terrible. You know, we've burnt about 10 million hectares across Canada this year. Most of it is in the northern parts of the province, or northern parts of the Northwest Territories. So I would say there's some similarities, but the other thing I would compare that with is right next to Finland is Russia. And Russia has a significant fire history. So I would, you know, if you look at Siberia, we get smoked out by them. So I haven't been to either country, but I look at it and say the intensity of management in Scandinavia is far. I don't think we're going to get to that level of management in British Columbia, but I'm saying we can at least make some steps towards it. So what can we do? I think we need to increase harvesting. I look at it and I say, when we had the fires in 2017 and 18, TOCO made significant efforts to try and salvage the fires. We said we could maybe do 10%. West Fraser said 15%. It was less than 5% ended up getting salvaged. And remember when I said when we don't salvage it, it doesn't get reforested either. And so I'm saying instead of waiting till it burns, why don't we harvest it, reforest it, have economic impacts, have a managed disturbance versus an unmanaged disturbance. Brad talked about and said all the things that we have to do as a company, as foresters, all the processes we have in place, terrain specialists, archaeological assessments, wildlife assessments, none of that happens on fires. So I would say we need to have a managed disturbance versus an unmanaged disturbance. We can control what happens, or as we can't in those other places. And just about done here, but there's some interesting things that have happened. And to me, it's kind of cool that it's actually happened in parks. There's a mountain pine beetle infestation in Jasper. The community in Parks Canada said, we're concerned that we're going to lose the town of Jasper. So they partnered with Canfor, put in a series of cut blocks, worked together, implemented it. You can see some variety of treatments in there, depending on the tree species. On the bottom left, there's some clear cuts, and there's some variable retention as you go further up. And the whole group, very proactive solution, working together, partnerships for something to happen. And to me, it's surprising it happened in a park. It's not happening in other places. Finally, this is Vernon. If you look, Silver Star Foothills on the left, and I used to look out this window all the time and I go, what's going to happen here? You know, wildland urban interface. And as people move more and more into rural areas, they have homes scattered in our forest. Now there's a bunch of programs like Fire Smart that work on individual homes and stuff, but it's still a significant concern for fires in these areas, and we need to do more in them. So finally, this is kind of your call to action. The world is run by those that show up. You know, I talked about the government owns the majority of our forest land, and in over 30 years of working in forestry, every time, it doesn't matter which government's in power, they change the rules, regulations, and forestry. It's not a good approach for a long-term vision. Doesn't matter who gets in, they change it. And they listen to people that show up. And right now, the people that are showing up are not the people in this room. They're not the forest companies. The people that are showing up and have the ear of government, both federally and provincially, are conservation groups. I remember even a few years ago going to a species at risk meeting, 70 people there, there was 22 environmental organizations there. 22, there was 3 people from forest companies. So my challenge for you is show up. Write a letter, have speeches like this, and get involved, because the silent majority message is not getting getting through to people. We need you. So finally, just we're going to have wildfires. It's a fact of life. But we're not planning to reduce them at a landscape level. We're doing some thinnings around communities, but the landscape level is where we need to do something. And the risks are real. I mean, you can't sugarcoat it. There's impacts on the environment, on wildlife, on water, tourism, economy, all those things. And a way to reduce that is to reduce the density and age of our forests. And finally, active sustainable forest management, reduce fires and their impacts. Any questions?
All right, you showed that triangle there that showed oxygen, heat, and fuel, and you talked about how it's the fuel that we can impact by managing healthy forests, right?
Yeah.
But the whole climate change thing is a big component of this too, is, you know, Earth is heating up, so we are getting warmer. And combating that, obviously, is actually a way to influence the heat thing. So is there some aspect of this in terms of, you know, making sure we understand carbon capture and understand managing healthy forests, that not just removing the fuel, but maybe helping at least keep the heat that we have at the temperatures we have today versus it getting hotter and hotter? Like, is there an element of that we can control?
So is your question is, if we focus on carbon emissions, can forest management help reduce carbon emissions and reduce overall temperature?
Yeah, I guess I was thinking about the triangle. You said we couldn't
Yep.
influence the first two, but we could the third, which is the fuel. But I'm wondering if we actually are having an impact on the second one, which is the heat.
Yeah, the fire triangle, I was thinking, the question is, can we influence the heat by reducing it? Yes, overall on an individual fire, but I was basically, the fire triangle I was referring to is, it needs these three elements. But certainly if it's, you know, the overall temperature, I mean, my understanding of global warming, climate change is the temperatures are pretty much set for the next 30 years, regardless of what we do. So really, the vision is to do something long-term instead of short-term. I don't know if that answers the question.
So you talked a little bit about reforestation requirements. So when we log a cut block, is there anything that we have to do differently when we're reforesting than we do for logging like a regular block?
So if it's, you mean, if we log a dead stand or a burnt stand versus a green stand?
Yes.
I mean, not really. I mean, they're basically a site assessment takes place. A forester goes out and they, you know, dig soil pits, all those types of things, and it looks what zone it's in. So the requirements are essentially the same as far as density and growth. So it doesn't differ for us as a forest company. Cool. Can I ask a question?
I may be misremembering or have something incorrect. Did they not used to do prescribed burns to clean up areas? And if so, they did,
Yeah.
correct? So what has changed? Why is that no longer, I mean, because basically that's what we're trying to do, right? To clean up an area to.
Oh, okay. So you're saying we used to do prescribed burns, we're not doing it anymore. For the prescribed burns that we did, for the most part, I did lots of them when I was younger, were after harvesting. So we used them to clean up cut blocks. And they went away for three things. Really, people were concerned about smoke. As a company, we're concerned about liability if they escaped on us, those types of things, and then just the overall cost. But as far as prescribed burns around communities to reduce the fire risk, not a lot. We used to do a lot of wildlife burns on, like, Shorts Creek Canyon was burnt out for bighorn sheep years ago. But we didn't do a lot of prescribed burns. And my issue with prescribed burns is they work well in those low elevation, thick bark species. Burning off mature forests that just burn massive, I don't understand why we're doing that. There's a difference. So low elevation, trees spaced out, that's a good ecological practice. They're grasslands to start with. We get up into higher elevation, they're thick forests. You really can't control that fire. They burn really hot.
Is there a concern about what would happen in the market if we were able to start logging a lot more and adding a lot more product into the market? Like, where's all that extra product gonna go? And
Well, that's a good question. So if we increase the supply of logs, would that impact the marketplace? So in the peak of mountain pine beetle in British Columbia and the coast, when I started working, we were logging about 90 million meters a year. A few years ago, we were down to about 65, 70 million meters a year. We're down to 40, less than 40 million meters this year. So we've dropped the volume harvested from our heyday over less than half of what we've done. So I don't know overall how it impacts the marketplace. I mean, you're in the forest industry, it goes up and down every year or two. It's maddening. But but I think if you look at it from a perspective on our forest, it's the right thing to do if we want to reduce some of these other impacts. The thing I see is I don't see any solutions being offered by people other than saying, let's just lock up our forests and it's natural and let them burn. Yeah.
Murray, can I assume that every province has its own forest management policy? Is there a coordinated effort at all to come together to talk about what's working, what's not, the impact from year over year?
Well, your question, is there a coordinated effort on legislation? I mean, Janice and Joe could answer that better than I can right now, but I would say that every province, as I mentioned earlier, every province forest policy is run by the party that gets in. So they usually have their own spin on how that's going to work, and there's not a lot of, I haven't seen a lot of coordination between individual policies. They're dramatically different depending on which province you go to.
Yeah, I would say that accurately describes it. The Canadian Council of Forest Ministers get together to chat about this stuff, but I'm not sure how much they actually resolve.
Well, just, you know, you showed the example of that park that was successfully, completed by CANFOR, and they were really happy with that. You would think that they would be able to demonstrate the success that they had from a park management that way, that maybe others could utilize to better manage their challenges in parks. Because I know when it comes to a park, nobody touches it, but we can have open campfires. I
think it comes down to that it's still, because the Crown, the people own the land base, it's very political. And it's that squeaky wheel. So who's going to go and lobby their point and say, this is what I want? And government listens to people that come and talk to them, and they listen to their people, the ones that they identify with. So you'll see different practices, and in British Columbia right now, the focus is on preservation. And that's the audience they're listening to. Last question, anyone?
Murray, does any of those environmentalist groups, do they have any RFPs on their teams? Like, what would be the counter argument? Where are they getting their science to argue against you or against this?
I think there's, so the question is, the conservation groups have people on staff that are foresters and stuff. If you get a chance, there's a YouTube video called The West is Burning. And to me, it's a fascinating video because it's based in California, Oregon, and Washington, maybe Montana, I'm not sure. But anyways, they have a conservation group lawyer that fought vehemently to shut down harvesting in those states. And she was successful. I mean, and in the end, they've realized now that they made a mistake. And she actually went back to this community where she was successful in closing the sawmill because of concerns, and saying, we want it reopened because we realize we need to harvest and manage our forests around here, because if we don't, they're all going to burn. That was pretty refreshing for me to see that. But in British Columbia, that hasn't happened. And a lot of our groups are funded by the US, to be honest, a lot of the trust funds and stuff like that. So they have a mission to stop natural resource activities, not just forestry, but mining, oil and gas, pick your pleasure. So I think do they have foresters and stuff like that on staff? Absolutely. I mean, there's a wide range of viewpoints. And I think your question brings up a really good point. Like, is Murray full of it? Like, do you just find some good pictures and stuff like that? How do I weed out all of this information? There's people telling me this, people telling me that. And for me, I look at it and say, is there evidence? Like, not just one study. I mean, I got a whole bunch of pictures. I mean, that's fairly compelling evidence. And I think you have to say, does it make sense? Does it pass the test that I believe this? But it is really challenging. I mean, people can doctor photos, they can do all kinds of things. So and then there's so many different studies out there. Which ones do you believe? So I think you have to look for credibility. You have to look for people that have a sound argument and see what their what's their motive for it? I mean, I'm retired now. I don't have a motive. I just think that we should be managing our forests.
Right on. Thanks a lot, Marie.
And if you have any questions after you're thinking about it and you want to text me or contact me, don't hesitate. Happy to do it.
I think that concludes our lunch and learn. Thanks again for Marie for doing our presentation.